Okay, thank you. So welcome to today's lecture on Freud and psychoanalysis, and I'll start with a question. Ever used the word subconscious? If you have, welcome to Freud's world. Ever lost your keys and cannot find them, and then a few hours later they show up in exactly that place that you were looking for them, and you just cannot work out how you could have missed them the first time around? Welcome to psychoanalysis. And let me start with a little anecdote. I had a friend when I was at university who was really very sharp and smart. She always did very well, and we often studied for exams together. Then one day for an exam, she didn't show up. After the exam was over, I spoke to her and asked her what happened. She was in a terrible state. She just did not understand how it could have happened, but she had set the alarm clock, and she realized afterwards, after it was too late, that she had set it for the wrong time, PM instead of AM. This was completely atypical of her. She was usually extremely responsible, fastidious, careful. How could this have happened? Welcome to psychoanalysis. So Sigmund Freud, there's a picture of him as a young man, as an old man on the screen, is born in the Czech Republic in 1856. He dies in London in 1938 at the age of 82. However, at a young age, he moves to Vienna and lives and works there all his life until he leaves Vienna for London, fleeing the Nazis in 1938, just a few months before his death. So he is really a product of Vienna, which is a real cultural hub at that time. He's trained as a medical doctor, specializing in neurology, but he very soon becomes interested in patients with psychological disturbances. And he spends the rest of his life working in that area. He develops the technique called psychoanalysis that we will be discussing today. Now, the psycho part of psychoanalysis is from the Greek word psyche, which means the mind. Basically, it just means the mind. So it's the same word as you find in psychology, right? And analysis, the analysis part of psychoanalysis, is the understanding of, or the breaking down into component parts so as better to understand what is happening. Psychoanalysis is nothing less than the attempt at understanding the functioning of the human mind. Take a look at this picture. You can see consists of this very solid rock and then a castle on top of the rock over there made out of the same material. This seems to be the very image of solidity and stability. Nothing you couldn't want for anything more in terms of a solid foundation. And yet this is only half of the picture. The rest of the picture is that, in fact. And this is a painting by René Magritte, who is a French painter from the 1930s. And in some ways, psychoanalysis works exactly on this distinction over here. And let me sum up what I think is Freud's most important contribution to contemporary thought. You think you're in control, but you're not. But it's not that you're not in control because somebody else is in control. That sometimes happens too, but that's not what I'm talking about. You think you're in control of yourself, but you are not, because another part of you, one that you are not aware of, is instead in control of who you are. There is a hidden part of you that is responsible for pretty much all that you do and all that you think. And this is what Freud calls the unconscious. Now, the unconscious, so in Freud's terms, the unconscious, most of what we do and think is actually the unconscious doing its thing. So most of who we are, most of the things that most of the way in which we live our lives is actually propelled by the unconscious. So Freud divides the mind up into two major parts, the unconscious that I've just been referring to, and the conscious, or consciousness, or the conscious. So the unconscious on the one hand, consciousness on the other hand. Now Freud, incidentally, Freud never uses the term subconscious. That's an invention of contemporary culture, but I'll come back to that in just a second. So consciousness is the you who you think you are. It's the you that is available to your awareness of yourself. You think about yourself, your character, your personality, your likes, your dislikes, your ethics and morality. All of that's consciousness. Now, attached to consciousness is the pre-conscious. It's really a kind of minor little part. Pre-conscious is what people are often referring to when they think about the subconscious. So it's like the reservoir from which consciousness draws for the most part. The things that you have forgotten, but that you can remember with a little effort and memory jogging, belong to the preconscious. So you forget somebody's name, but then somebody reminds you, there it is, you've got it now. That was in your preconscious. The unconscious, however, is radically different to the conscious and preconscious systems. It consists of the things you don't even know you think. And what is more, it's blocked to your own conscious thinking. You can't get to it just by thinking, by remembering. It's barred, we say, it's barred or hidden from consciousness. The preconscious, by the way, you can get to by thinking. You can try and remember and you will get there. But the unconscious, no matter how much effort you make, you cannot get there just by thinking it through. So how does the unconscious happen? Where does it come from? We aren't born with it. It comes into being as we develop as children. So in the first place, this is a story about growing up, and it thus starts with infancy. I want you to stop and think for a moment about what happens to kids as they get older and how we as adults deal with them. On the one hand, when kids are very young, they're uncoordinated, they know nothing. And we're always saying to them, do this, do that, do this, don't do that, to teach them and to protect them, of course, in many ways. But think about this another way. One of the things we're doing as we say, do this, don't do that, is we're teaching them about becoming social human beings. We're teaching them to follow more and more the rules of society, of what we can and cannot do. And if you think about it, most of the time you pass with them very young is actually spent saying to them, don't do that. Rather more than saying do that, we spend much more time saying don't do that. Kids seem to want to do lots of things that we as adults think they shouldn't be doing. But if you follow this through a little bit more about this phenomenon of having to say no to kids all the time, we arrive at this strange proposition. In order to become a functioning human being, a social being, like the people we live amongst and see around us, we only get to be that by learning not to do. There are tons of things we do as kids that are entirely unacceptable, and we have to learn not to do them. So it's not just a question of learning to do things, but more a question of learning not to do things. But now here's the problem. We have these desires that are just not permissible in society. What do? So that's as a kid, you want to do things, you're always being told not to do them, right? So what do? As you're getting older, you try to forget them. But think how long it takes to get kids to change, how long it takes to get kids to change, how often you have to say no. Forgetting of desires is very difficult. In fact, says Freud, we never forget. We never stop in our desires. They never go away. They just persist. So what do you do as a subject? What do you do when faced with what you desire so strongly, which is also the thing that you're prohibited from indulging? Well, says Freud, because these things are forbidden, but equally because they don't go away, because you can't get rid of them, you suppress them. It's a technical term, you suppress them. They're pushed kind of underground, and you try your best not to be aware of them. In fact, you pretend to yourself, although let's be technical here, your consciousness, because that's the you you're aware of, your consciousness pretends to itself that those things don't exist. The technical term for this, as I say, is repression. We repress those forbidden, prohibited desires. This means that they effectively become split off from our conscious minds. And that thing that consciousness excludes from itself, rejects from itself, and tries to forget is the unconscious. It's unconscious precisely because it's forbidden from entering consciousness. I can't emphasize enough how these things are radically separated from each other. It's not that conscious and unconscious are kind of closely related. They're two completely separate entities in the mind. Thus, the unconscious, containing all those desires, splits off, becomes its own entity with its own rules and modes of functioning, some of which we'll see in just a moment. And those desires stay in there, bubbling away. They continue to affect us. They infiltrate our lives, push us in all sorts of strange directions, make us all do all sorts of things that our consciousness would never dream of, like the examples given above, right? Like the examples of being late for an exam or for losing your keys. That's the unconscious at work. Think of the unconscious as a suitcase into which you put all the things that are forbidden to you, all the thoughts, wishes, desire that you carry around with you, except that you don't know you're carrying it. So now we have the mind divided into two main parts, conscious and unconscious, or 2.5 with the preconscious. And just to come back to memories for a moment, some memories you can recall, as we said, for the preconscious, right? So the ones that you can recall come from the preconscious. But some deep, deep memories relating to forbidden wishes and desires will become repressed and dispatched to the unconscious, To consciousness, those repressed memories will appear to have been forgotten because they are not even preconscious anymore. But in reality, they will not be forgotten or erased, but simply partitioned off. As I say, like sent off to a suitcase or to a dark room in a house whose existence you are not even aware of. Now, I'm going to talk for a moment about subjectivity, just generally. We mentioned this already in relation to consciousness. It concerns you as a subject. You think of yourself. You have an idea of who you are, of what makes you you. You know who you are because you think of yourself. You are the subject of your consciousness. But now here's the strange part. As far as you're concerned, when you think about yourself, you are one person, right? When you think about what you are, what you like, you're one person. But from now on, with the unconscious, the subject is not one, but two. There is one you who is the conscious, and another you who is the unconscious. Your conscious is thinking about you in one way, and your unconscious is thinking in another. I'll give you another example. For example, you're walking along the street, and you see something lying on the sidewalk. The kid in your unconscious says, as all kids do, something in front of me on the floor. Yum, let me put it in my mouth. Your conscious, on the other hand, the adult in you, is saying, yuck, that's disgusting. You are the subject of two desires, and you don't know it or feel it consciously because it's all unconscious. You are, on a very minor level in this example, a conflicted subject, torn between two desires, between two subject positions. Now, you can see why these childish desires have to be repressed, right? No socialized, functioning adult in their right mind could possibly admit to themselves that they have a desire such as this. In fact, says psychoanalysis, your disgust is one of the mechanisms to help you keep your repressed desires at a distance, to disavow that desire. And so again, to return to those opening examples, you lose your keys, right? You lose your keys because your unconscious is saying, if you stop and somewhere along the line, it will turn out that your unconscious is saying, whatever it is that you're getting the keys for so that I can leave the house, I don't want to go there. I just don't want to be at that appointment that you've made, so I have to leave right now. And what happens, of course, you leave, you lose your keys, you're looking for them. Maybe your unconscious is thinking, I missed that appointment, I don't go. That exam that you've accidentally set the clock for at the wrong time, terrified about that exam, your unconscious is thinking, oh, if only I could miss that exam. So that's these two different desires that are actually operating. One in your unconscious is forcing you to do things. Your conscious is relatively weak in relation to those things. And let me give you a diagram of this. So this is a diagram, a very schematic diagram of Freud's model. And as you can see, so just very loosely over here, there's the conscious level, which is that section on top over there, and then the unconscious level. And the important thing about this diagram is the solid black line that runs between them. You can't get from one to the other. It's like a wall in between them. And you can see, so the preconscious, those are the things that you might think of, saved knowledge, memories, various thoughts and things. But then in this section, there are all kinds of other things that we're going to talk about in just a minute. But that's the kind of model. It's generally theorized. I mean, there's no way of quantifying this, but generally, we think that there's a lot, your unconscious is a lot stronger. There's a lot more happening in your unconscious than there actually is in your conscious. Now, some broad repercussions of this. I want to come to the main theme of your reading for today, which is civilization and its discontents. Civilization, let's start with that. It's the thing we think of as being the greatest achievement of humanity. Civilization relates to our social being, to our construction of society, our living together in community. Before Freud, just to be a little bit crude about this, before Freud, people just asked, how can we make society better? People thought we could get better at doing it, that there was nothing really standing in the way of constructing a better society. And that even more than that, the better the society, the happier we will be as humans. But Freud says, no, that's not how it works. He says our human nature, because of our unconscious, is fundamentally opposed to civilization. Freud is the first person to look at society and say that it's something that doesn't really suit us as humans, paradoxically. Society gives us all sorts of benefits, but also it hurts us. To become civilized, we pay a huge price. We sacrifice a very large part of who we are, and that sacrifice really is very painful. We repress our desires. We cannot indulge them, and so we are discontent. For most social theorists who are not Freudians, the question is, how can we construct a society that allows us all to be happy? Freud says, no matter what you do with society, we will always be unhappy, because the simple fact of being in society already prevents us from reaching happiness by forcing us to repress our unconscious desires. And to give you another example, just talking about children and the things we don't allow children to do. Think about things that we want to do. Think of the violence of children. That violence is anathema to society, to civilization. Civilization has to banish it because it constitutes a disintegrative force of society. These forces have to be banned. But being desires, they don't go away. They go into the unconscious, where they are repressed and always unhappy because they cannot be fulfilled. So you can see that according to Freud, the mind is not just a big machine churning out ideas. It's very carefully organized into a series of compartments. And there is one more we have to talk about. Right? Now, the you of consciousness is also called the ego in some senses. But really, the ego is just a fancy Greek term for the I. But there's one more thing kind of attached to the ego, and that's called the superego. And again, I'm presuming that most of you have heard of this vocabulary, but not necessarily in this technical sense. So think back to the kids. No, 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 we're always saying to them. But at a certain point, as they grow up, you don't have to say no so much anymore. They have learned the lessons you have been trying to teach them. They have become self-policing, in a sense. They have learned to say no to themselves. And that's because they have internalized the voice of authority saying no. You don't have to say it anymore because you are now inside their head saying no to them. They hear an authority voice saying no, but it's coming from inside. They have sectioned off another part of their mind that is now fully occupied by what was once an external voice, but is now an internal voice. This is called the superego. It's super as in above. So it's above the ego, like a policeman looking down on you saying no. Now, this is important. When you say no to yourself, it is you saying no, but also it's not you. It's a part of you, but it's a part of you that has been colonized or taken over by an outside authority voice. And I'm going to show you a slightly more complex diagram of the mind, Freudian mind. So there we go. That's that bar, that barrier in between the unconscious there and the conscious over there. And then part of the conscious is sectioned off over here as the ego, and then now you have that extra section over there, which is the superego, which functions both in relation to the ego and in relation to the unconscious. But the superego is the part, and over here you can see moral imperatives, contains the conscience. So this is the part of you that's kind of regulating your behavior in relation to society. Now the superego on the one hand is a good thing. It's responsible for your good behavior in society, and that you are here today more or less behaving yourselves. But it can also cause all sorts of problems, and the major one here is guilt. I feel so guilty. I lied to my parents. I told them I was going to study with a friend, but really I went clubbing and had a wild night out on the town. On the one hand, your parents will be upset if they know, but worse than your parents being upset with you is the fact that you are upset with yourself. That corrosion of your soul, the way the thought comes back to you and eats you up inside, is your superego kind of biting into your ego. It's your idea of your parents. And think about this, often the idea of your parents is worse than the reality. So guilt leads to severe psychological problems, paralysis, depression, distress. So now we have a model of the mind as sectioned off in various parts, but crucially now we see in conflict with itself, right? This is the essential part. The mind has got these very neat components in a sense according to Freud, but those components are all fighting with each other. So the very sense of ourselves, of our subjectivity, is of a conflicted model, always fighting with ourselves. Now, I've so far given you examples drawn from everyday life of the repressed not going away, the things that we all do. But what Freud is famous for is treating disturbed people or neurotics. And in relation to mentally disturbed people, Freud discovers that many illnesses are caused by what he calls the return of the repressed. Say you hate potatoes. Makes no sense. Everyone loves potatoes. And it gets worse and worse, and you become ill and you gag and you throw up at the thought of them. And you are obsessed. Every time you go out for a meal, you think, what if there are potatoes in there? And eventually it becomes so bad that you're scared to leave the house, and it really ruins your life. So you go to a psychoanalyst and you talk about it, and slowly you discover a memory. Another child at school, someone who was a bully, who persecuted you, who really made you suffer. And this guy was always eating chips. And every time he approached you, you could smell those chips and you knew what was coming. But after a time had passed and you grew up, you lost your awareness of the whole nasty, horrible event. But you thought that you forgot those events. But in reality, you repressed them because they were too painful for you to bear, and because you hated to think of yourself as a coward and a victim. And then years later, you suddenly find that you cannot bear potatoes or chips, and the fear takes over your life, and you have no idea why. This is the return of the repressed. Ideas sit in that dark suitcase or in that dark room that I was talking about and haunt you. And you are aware of the haunting, you're aware of the effect, but you have no idea where it comes from, because it comes from a part of you of which you are literally unconscious. Now, Freud develops a therapy about bringing things to consciousness. He believes that you can unlock those problems, and the theory is that if you bring those repressed thoughts out of that dark suitcase and you think them through, you will hopefully get better. Once you relive them, think about them, face them, instead of repressing them, you draw that ferocious energy out of them, and they stop haunting you to the same degree. Make the unconscious conscious, and its dark power fades away. But now, excuse me. But now, to talk about the unconscious in more detail, which is where this is all happening. So as I've been stressing, the unconscious is not just conscious, but un. It has a very different mode of operation. Consciousness is characterized by reason. It's where reasoning and logic happen. It's really pretty much hopefully our everyday way of thinking. Why are you late? There was a terrible traffic jam. Why are you wearing a jacket? I was cold. The unconscious, however, operates in a completely different fashion. There's no reason, there's no logic. Why are you late? The answer could be because the trees are green. There's no time in the unconscious. There are no opposites. A is bigger than B also means that B is bigger than A. It's a completely different process that happens in the unconscious. And we actually have names for these. So the processes of consciousness, which is reason, is called secondary process, right? So that's the way in which you think logically. You can kind of work out one step going to the next step. Why are you eating? Because I'm hungry. In the unconscious, however, we call that primary process, and that's completely unconstrained by logic. So as I said, to give you an example, why are you late? Because the trees are green. Doesn't make any sense, but that's an example of primary process. Now I'm going to give you a detailed diagram of something like the way in which primary process might work. Now let me show you something. So let's say we start off with the word chair, okay? And then we think chair, what's the next thought that might occur to us? Table, right? And then we think table, well, table might have a leg. And then a leg, well, legs could be broken. And then the opposite of broken could be perfect, right? So this is a chain of associations that happens over here. Then we can go in the other direction. Table, something that sounds like it, is stable. Stable, something that's related to stable, is strong. But stable also is where you might get a horse. Horses are about locomotion. From a horse you might get to a car, because that's a modern way of locomotion. And then car, you might go shopping over there. Now, in primary process, this is an example of the way primary process that might work. Now, you'll notice that each one of these is related to what goes before it by some kind of an association. There's some kind of internal logic that gets them together. But the issue is that the way in which those particular associations are not logical associations, and they change from one area to the next, right? So chair and table is a relation that happens because usually you find chairs and tables together. Table, because there's a leg that applies to it. Now you're thinking kind of adjectives. What are characteristics of adjectives? Well, a leg could be broken, but now you have the opposite over there, right? Which is the opposite of broken from perfect. But then look at this one. This is really one of the strange ones. The only relation between these ones is a rhyming, phonetic one. Table and stable kind of go together because of a sound association. And then, excuse me. And then once you get that sound association, we jump into a completely different area and a whole series of associations that spread off from that. So this is characteristic of primary process. There are associations, but the associations are of many, many different types. Now, Freud also hypothesizes that in the unconscious, once you have this primary process working like this, each one of these items is equivalent to the other. All right, now, this is crucially important. In the unconscious, each one of these things has a similar kind of a value. I'll explain that in just a second. Now, this equivalence between all these items gives you some strange results. Say you have something in your unconscious that it really wants to express, that it's obsessed by. Let's go back to that guy who tortured you at school. And you really hate him and you want to break his neck. Your unconscious can represent that breaking his neck by any one of these ideas along the chain. So you start off, you've got broken over there, but you can represent that in your unconscious. Breaking somebody else's neck could just as easily be associated with stable. This is when we say that primary process, there is no logic that's really associated with them. Now, now once you're thinking of this, your unconscious is really thinking of this idea of you really want to break that guy's neck. You can, as I say, you can move along any one of these items in the chain. Maybe you keep on thinking of a chair. Maybe you think of a perfect round circle. Any or all of these could represent that fundamental wish of breaking that person's neck. And in fact, this example, as I first gave it to you, is a little unrealistic. It's unlikely that you would hate potatoes because that's too direct, right? This is not, the whole thing about this chain over here is its indirectness. You might have a terrible aversion, rather, or obsession with vinegar, or something further along the chain of associations, like you might be completely upset by crinkly packets, or something like that. Now, how does this come out? It comes out in behavior, as we saw some of the examples above. In fact, many neurotic symptoms are the acting out of these wishes. In our example above of the guy who tortured you, say you're always breaking chairs, or you're terrified of horses, for example. By the way, see what I mean by repressed wishes being incompatible with society and civilization. Your innermost wish is to be violent for a reason you don't even remember. Civilization can't deal with that. But there are other ways in which these wishes, these repressed unconscious wishes, come out. One of them is something like we're looking at over here, which is the process of what Freud calls free association. So you go to a psychoanalyst. Psychoanalysis is famous for having the therapist, and there's a couch. You lie down on the couch, and you say the first thing that pops into your mind, and slowly you trace your way back along the chain of associations. So you move way back to the original thought. That's one of the traditional methods of psychoanalysis. But another one of them that Freud is also famous for is dreams. When you are asleep, when all your defenses and the distractions of reality are down, that's when your unconscious roams free. Those strange images that pop up in your dreams, that's the chain of associations rolling along. But talking about those wishes coming out, remember most of the things that are in your unconscious are only there because they're too unacceptable, repulsive even, to be accepted by the consciousness. And that means that when the unconscious wants to express itself, consciousness will not allow those wishes to appear in the form that it finds repulsive. So the unconscious finds a way to get around the conscious prohibition, and it does this through a system of disguise. It's like trying to sneak into a party from which you have been forbidden. You get past the guards by disguising yourself. Now, the only conditions under which the unconscious passes into consciousness is through a disguise. And this chain of associations provides the means of disguise. Break his neck, too violent for your sense of self, think of a chair. Now this keeps all the parts almost happy. To the unconscious, each of these is the same. So neck and chair have the same psychic value. But to consciousness, neck is impossible, but chair is okay. So it comes through as a chair. So the dream that you remember, i.e. the dream that becomes conscious, is what remains of a wish or a desire or a memory once it has passed through disguise. It's like going to a costume ball, a dress-up party or a disguise party, where all you see are strange costumes and masks. This is one of the reasons dreams are so weird. It's the disguise pushing things around so that your consciousness doesn't recognize them. People love to record their dreams to tell others about them, but all they're doing is looking at the surface disguise. The true content is lurking below the surface, evading your prying eyes. It's like trying to catch a thief and all you grab is their jacket. Your collection of your dreams is mostly a collection of jackets that you've pulled off their backs. The thieves always escape. But the guards at the door aren't perfect. The disguise is often not perfect too, and you can sometimes work out what's underneath it. One of the things the unconscious likes to do with these elements is to blend together things, often in images. So if I'm thinking about something in a dream or some kind of recollection, I'm thinking, it was the shop assistant I saw in the store yesterday. But it's weird, she looked like my sister in the dream. And wait, even more like my mother. It kind of all gets melded and condensed together. And often in the process of condensation, you can find the truth of what your unconscious is getting at. Who exactly? So in my dream, it looked mostly like the shop assistant, but really it was my mother that I was thinking about. Now, on to content. Let me talk a little bit about content. You may notice that so far I've been talking about a map of the mind and also about the mechanisms of how it all works, of how it all fits together. But I haven't said much about the content, the subject matter of what goes into the unconscious. But in fact, Freud goes into a lot of detail about content, not just the desires in general. It's not just that desires in general get repressed. Specific desires get repressed or come to take on more importance. And here we're talking about something that Freud is absolutely famous for, which is sex. When Freud analyzes his patients, there is one topic above all others that he finds there: sex. Let me tell you a little story that comes to us from ancient Greece. There's a man called Oedipus. He comes from the Greek city of Corinth, and he goes traveling. While he's traveling, he gets into a fight at a crossroads, and he kills somebody. He kills a man at a crossroads. Later, he arrives in the city of Thebes, which is ruled over by a queen. There he performs a heroic deed that the people of the city much appreciate. He marries the queen of the city, the people of the city much appreciate. He's proclaimed king in gratitude. He marries the queen of the city and has 2 daughters by her. Several years later, through a strange sequence of events, he discovers that he had, in fact, been born in the city of Thebes. In fact, he was the son of the king, but had been given away for adoption at an early age, precisely to the town of Corinth, where he had grown up. Now, you may think that this is something of a happy fairy tale. Not so. He's born the son of the king, and through a series of accidents of fate, he returns to the place of his birth, although he didn't know it, to take his place on the throne. But no, that's not how it turns out. The story takes a dreadful turn. It further emerges that the man he had killed at the crossroads was his own father, and the woman he has married, the queen, and by whom he has had children, is his own mother. This is the myth of Oedipus. This is the myth of Oedipus, and it is a famous play by Sophocles, Oedipus Rex, or Oedipus the King, by Sophocles, ancient Greek playwright from around 430 BC, from ancient Greece. Now, Freud says it's not just a great play. It's not just a great play in the myth, but it is a great play because it tells the truth of our own secret desires. Up to now, I have spoken about the unconscious as being the place where our repressed memories and desires end up. For Freud, the most important repressed desire in the unconscious is the one where boys wish to murder their fathers and marry their mothers, and for girls, murder their mothers and marry their fathers. This is probably the most controversial point of Freud's whole work. It's called the Oedipus complex, and you should know about it because it figures largely in popular culture and cultural history. Now, whether you believe the specific details or not of wanting to murder and then marry, the crucial point concerns the notion of sex being at the core of the unconscious, and it's one of the key ideas of psychoanalysis. And before you scoff too loudly, just ask yourself if your boyfriend or girlfriend doesn't have lots in common with one of your parents. And look around and see how many people have partners that look like their parent of the opposite sex. I say that just in passing. And if you think about it, it makes sense. When you're young, who are you closest to? Who touches your body, caresses you, holds you? Who gives you the most love? To the infant, these are intensely pleasurable, yet have to be renounced as you get older. But those desires, as we saw, don't ever go away. They get pushed into the unconscious, where they stay as desires seeking satisfaction. Now again, whether you believe in Oedipus or not, the idea of the sex in the unconscious is central. Freud gives an example of a woman who several times a day runs into a room, upsets a glass of water onto a tablecloth, and calls in the maid, right? So she's in a room, there's a glass of water on the table, she upsets the glass of water onto the tablecloth and calls in the maid. It's totally bizarre, no one knows what it's about, it seems to make no sense, but it's ruining everybody's life. Now, on analysis, Freud works it out. Freud kind of unpacks the story in this way. It turns out that this woman had married, when she was young, she had married a much older man, and that he could not consummate the marriage on the wedding night. The woman is very embarrassed and hopes the maid in the morning will not notice, and so she throws red ink on the sheets. This is what happens, this is the true event that happens in her early married life. Years later, she has forgotten the episode, but has developed a strange symptom. Now see how many strands come together here. Sex, it's all about sex, the return of the repressed. And her wish is to prove that her husband is not impotent, and she repeats the action to show the maid her proof. But see the primary process in action, right? See that chain of associations moving along. So she wants to show the maid, but this is a different maid to the one who was there originally, right? But in the unconscious primary process, it's working the maid, any maid. See also the chain of associations from blood to red ink to now later in her life, water. Again, moving along the chain of the primary process. And see the disguise as well, the efficiency of the disguise. To the maid, indeed to anyone, it's all meaningless. It only means something in her unconscious. Right? So that's the essential aspect of the neurotic symptom. It doesn't mean virtually to her, herself in her unconscious. It doesn't mean anything to people who are looking around. It doesn't mean anything. That's the effect of the disguise. It's only working its magic, in a sense, inside her unconscious. So to end with a few pages, and to return to civilization and its discontents. We spoke earlier about our inner wishes, not just violence, but most importantly, sex, which has to be controlled by society. Now we saw that civilization forces us to repress our instincts, our desires, and so we are unhappy. But we have also seen that repression does not work 100%, because the repressed always returns, and when it returns, when repression is undone, it threatens to tear society apart. No one is ever happy in the story. As humans, we're unsatisfied because suppressed, but civilization and society is always under attack by failed repression. Society is always in a fragile state, just about to collapse. It's all a very unstable balance. Now let me talk just a moment about controversies and revolutions. Now, on the one hand, one of the revolutionary aspects of Freud that's not often mentioned, if you're thinking about what we colloquially call craziness or madness. Before Freud, mad was just mad, right? It was unreachable. If somebody was mad, there was no way you could get through to them. Freud was the first person, really, to listen to mad people and to think that underneath the craziness, there was some internal logic. Even though it was not secondary process logic, it's primary process logic, even if it didn't make sense within the normal standards of reason. And that really, I think, is one of Freud's major revolutions. Now, controversial. Freud is extremely controversial, all aspects of it. Many people don't like the idea of the unconscious, but in fact, I think most people, every time you're using the subconscious, you're kind of getting at the idea of the unconscious. So certainly in the Western world, I think many people accept this idea. There's another controversy as well, which is about the therapy of psychoanalysis. Many people say that the therapy has mixed results. It doesn't always work. But interestingly enough, Freud is one of the first people who actually almost undermines his own therapy, and he develops the idea of resistance to therapy. Right? He's the first one to admit that it's very, very difficult to unwind these knots that have developed in the primary process. So therapy might work, it might not work, but that's no proof really of the truth or otherwise of his theory. But we still have to come back to sex for a moment. If you mention Freud in popular culture, most people will think of the sex angle. And without a doubt, this is one of his major revolutions. It's highly controversial, but simultaneously most influential. And however much you may knock him and criticize him, I'm afraid he's already won. How so? This idea of sex at the core of the unconscious also means that sex is at the core of who we are. But if this was a revolutionary idea in 1900 in Vienna. Hasn't it become true now? We in our modern times don't stop talking about sex. It's with us all the time. That it is so prevalent in our popular culture, from advertising to the way we dress. Think about the way we're dressed now compared to the way these women are dressed in the picture over here. To music, to particularly music videos. And I just have to mention here, think about that Nicki Minaj video, Anaconda. This all, in some ways, goes back to Freud. I'm not saying he caused it, but he opened the subject and began thinking about it very early. This idea of humans as inherently sexual, that sex is at our center, is also an idea that is accepted now, I think, by many people in Western society, for sure. Before Freud, sex was never at the center of the universe. Think of how people dressed and how they behaved. So this example, another example, this is Queen Victoria. As I say, before Freud, sex was never at the center of the universe. Think of how people dressed and behaved. Sex was something never spoken about, never really acknowledged. This is one of Freud's major revolutions. He really changed the way in which we think of ourselves. But personally, I think the greatest revolution is not sex, but the notion of the unconscious. The idea that a part of us is not only beyond our control, but beyond our knowing. That we are not in control of ourselves, that we are strangers to ourselves, that we are not one subject, but two. These ideas are profoundly destabilizing. This goes against everything that we think we are. Our whole civilization is built on this idea that ultimately we are sovereign individuals in control of ourselves, doing what we want. Not so, says Freud. In this respect, Freud is often paired with Darwin. Darwin shocked everyone by overturning the idea that we are, as humans, a special creation of God. People were amazed at the idea that we are just like animals, related to monkeys and chimpanzees. Freud takes this debunking of our elevated idea of ourselves even further. We're not even in control of ourselves. We're not even masters in our own houses. And his idea of civilization and its discontents is still something that we struggle with every day. Ultimately, says Freud, the part of us that most strongly wants to do what it wants to do cannot because of civilization. And the part of us that actually can do what it wants to do is really making do with second best. Thank you.